My phone screen lit up, a harsh, artificial glare against the dim, amber-toned ambience of Le Bernardin. The text message was brief, punctuated by a perfectly curated emoji. Happy 10th anniversary, sweetheart. Drowning in this investor presentation at the office. Make it up to you this weekend. I didn't reply. I didn't have to. I simply lifted my gaze from the glowing screen and looked exactly 2 tables over. There he was, my husband, David, leaning across the crisp, white linen tablecloth, his hand tenderly cupping the cheek of a stunning, impeccably dressed woman who looked like she had been born into a Manhattan penthouse. He kissed her. It wasn't a fleeting peck. It was the kind of kiss you reserve for the center of your universe. My heart didn't shatter. I didn't gasp or drop my crystal water goblet. Instead, a cold, absolute clarity washed over me. I placed my linen napkin on the table and braced my hands on the armrests of my chair, preparing to stand, walk over, and flip that heavy oak table directly into their laps. Before my weight could shift, a hand clamped down on my wrist. The grip was ironclad, belonging to a woman I had never seen before. She had slid into the empty seat beside me like a ghost. Her tailored charcoal suit and sharp, observing eyes screamed corporate predator. She leaned in, the scent of expensive sandalwood and cold espresso washing over me, and whispered directly into my ear. Calm down. Don't ruin it. The real show is about to start. I didn't cry that night. Crying is a messy, biological response to emotional trauma. What I had just witnessed wasn't a heartbreak. It was a critical data breach. And sitting there, listening to the clinking of fine silverware and the soft jazz floating through the restaurant, I began calculating exactly how to erase my husband's entire existence on paper. Legally, methodically, without leaving a single fingerprint. Before I show you how I systematically dismantled his entire life and turned his arrogance into a federal indictment, subscribe to the channel. This isn't just a story of infidelity. It's a blueprint for taking your power back when the world thinks you're invisible. Stay with me. My name is Sarah Hayes. I am 34 years old, and for the last 8 years, I have worked as a medical billing and documentation coordinator for a mid-sized suburban health clinic in New Jersey. If you were to ask David, my soon-to-be ex-husband, what I do for a living, he would likely roll his eyes, adjust the cuffs of a tailored shirt he bought using our joint account, and dismiss it as visionless clerical work. He sold high-end luxury vehicles to people who couldn't afford them. He thrived on the hustle, the optical illusion of wealth, the firm handshake, and the flashy smile. To him, success was loud. To me, success was silent. It was hidden in the alphanumerics of ICD-10 and CPT codes. My job was supposedly mundane. I sat beneath buzzing fluorescent lights, staring at dual monitors, processing insurance claims. But what David never understood is that medical billing isn't about pushing paper. It is a grueling, tactical war against multi-billion-dollar insurance conglomerates. I spent my days dissecting fraudulent denials, exploiting bureaucratic loopholes, and forcing impenetrable financial systems to cough up the money they owed. I didn't see paper. I saw architecture. I saw the fragile threads that held a person's entire financial reality together. David's reality, on the other hand, was built on sand. For the past 6 months, the microaggressions had escalated. He would come home late, the faint, metallic scent of the Lincoln Tunnel clinging to his coat, and toss his keys onto the kitchen island with a heavy sigh. He was always closing a massive investor deal in the city. He would look at my clinic ID badge, still clipped to my cardigan, and offer a pitying, tight-lipped smile. Still fighting over $50 copays? His eyes would say. I ignored the condescension. What I couldn't ignore were the numbers. I managed our finances, a necessity, given his erratic commission-based income. Lately, the joint account had begun bleeding. $50 here, $100 there. Uber rides at odd hours. Charges at artisanal coffee shops in Tribeca. When I calmly asked him about it one evening while wiping down the countertops, he had scoffed, pouring himself a glass of scotch. It's called networking, Sarah, he had said, his tone dripping with that practiced, patronizing patience. You have to spend money to make money. It's a different league over there. Not exactly the billing department at a strip mall clinic. I had just nodded, letting him believe he had won the interaction. I never argued. Arguing was inefficient. The turning point came 3 days before our 10th anniversary. It was a Tuesday. I was gathering his dry cleaning, checking the pockets of his navy blazer, the one he only wore for his investor meetings. My fingers brushed against a crumpled piece of thermal paper. I pulled it out and smoothed it over the ironing board. It was a valet parking receipt. There was no date, just a timestamp of 11:45 p.m. from 3 nights prior. At the top, stamped in elegant black ink, was the logo of Le Bernardin, one of the most exclusive, astronomically expensive restaurants in Manhattan. David had told me he was eating stale pizza in a midtown conference room that night. I stood there in the quiet hum of our laundry room, staring at the little slip of paper. He thought I was just a boring clerk, blind to the world outside my cubicle. But he forgot the one fundamental rule of the universe I operated in. People lie. Words lie. Tears lie. But numbers? Numbers are absolute. I folded the receipt into a perfect, sharp square and slipped it into my pocket. The audit had officially begun. The decision to drive into the city wasn't born out of some desperate, romantic need to reclaim my marriage. It was an audit. I needed to verify the discrepancy between the David who claimed to be drowning in boardroom negotiations and the David whose valet receipts placed him at the epicenter of Manhattan's elite culinary scene. I wore my tailored navy sheath dress, the one that projected competence rather than allure, and navigated the Lincoln Tunnel with the steady precision of someone accustomed to long, unglamorous commutes. When I handed my keys to the valet outside the restaurant, the heavy glass doors yielded to a world built entirely on exclusion. The acoustics inside were engineered to swallow loud noises, reducing the atmosphere to a hushed, golden-lit sanctuary of clinking baccarat crystal and whispered wealth. I didn't ask the maitre d' for his table. I simply stood near the velvet-draped entryway, letting my eyes adjust to the amber glow, scanning the room. It took me less than 40 seconds to locate the anomaly. David was seated at a corner booth, practically vibrating with that performative, alpha male energy he usually reserved for selling overpriced SUVs. But it was the woman across from him who demanded attention. She wasn't just beautiful, she possessed the kind of effortless, generational wealth that doesn't need to try. Her silk slip dress draped perfectly, her posture was relaxed, and the way she looked at David was not with the skepticism of a prospective investor, but with the starry-eyed adoration of a woman completely sold on a manufactured dream. Then came the kiss. The one I detailed earlier. The one that should have shattered my world. Instead of a breaking heart, I felt a familiar, icy hyperfocus settle over my brain. It was the exact sensation I experienced when a multi-million-dollar insurance provider attempted to deny a critical claim on a technicality. You don't get emotional. You look for the structural flaw in their argument. I was preparing to dismantle his evening when the woman in the charcoal suit materialized beside me. Her grip on my wrist was not aggressive, but it was absolute. It carried the unspoken authority of a woman who fired executives before breakfast. She leaned in, her sandalwood perfume masking the scent of roasted truffles in the air. "Calm down. Don't ruin it," she breathed, her voice a low, perfectly modulated hum. "The real show is about to start." She didn't wait for my reaction. With a sleight of hand that would have made a magician envious, she pressed something cold and metallic into my palm, released my wrist, and melted back into the crowd of affluent diners, disappearing through a side exit. I looked down at my hand. Resting in the center of my palm was a heavy, matte black encrypted flash drive. I didn't confront David. I didn't cause a scene. I turned on my heel, retrieved my car from the valet, and drove the 45 minutes back to our quiet, aggressively mundane suburban home in New Jersey. The silence of the house felt different now. It wasn't a sanctuary. It was a crime scene waiting to be processed. I bypassed the kitchen, went straight into the spare room I used as a home office, and booted up my workstation. The dual monitors flared to life, casting a harsh, blue light across my face. I plugged the flash drive into the USB port. There was no password prompt. Just a single, meticulously organized root folder titled D. Hayes, asset liquidity and liabilities. I opened the first PDF. It was a bank statement from an offshore holding company, but it was the second document that made the air in my home office suddenly turn to ice. It was a mortgage agreement. A second mortgage. My eyes darted across the digital pages, parsing the legal jargon with the speed of a seasoned bureaucrat. David hadn't just been playing a rich investor to seduce an heiress. To fund his illusion, the designer suits, the Le Bernardin dinners, the first-class flights he claimed his company paid for, he had leveraged the equity of our home. The home where I had painstakingly saved the $60,000 down payment from my visionless clerical work. I scrolled to the final page, zooming in on the signature line. There was David's bold, sprawling scrawl. And right beneath it, resting on the dotted line, was my signature. Sarah E. Hayes. Except it wasn't mine. I stared at the loop of the S, the slight tremor in the baseline of the H. It was a remarkably good forgery, likely practiced for hours. He had bypassed a notary, probably utilizing one of his shady dealership contacts, to sign away the financial security I had spent a decade building, all to play a millionaire playboy for a woman in Manhattan. He didn't just cheat on my body. He had cannibalized my identity. I sat back in my ergonomic chair. A lesser woman would have wept. A lesser woman would have packed a bag, called a divorce lawyer, and spent the next 5 years fighting for scraps in a family court while he hid the assets. But I wasn't a lesser woman. I was a billing coordinator. My entire professional existence was dedicated to finding the one missing comma that could bankrupt a system. I spent the next 3 hours copying every file, cross-referencing routing numbers, and building a secure, off-site digital dossier. By 1:30 a.m., I had a complete, irrefutable map of his financial felonies. At 2:15 a.m., the soft mechanical hum of the garage door broke the silence of the house. I quickly powered down the monitors, slipped the flash drive into the hollow spine of a medical coding dictionary on my shelf, and slid into bed, pulling the duvet up to my chin. 10 minutes later, the bedroom door clicked open. The heavy, dragging footsteps of a man bloated on expensive wine and his own ego crossed the carpet. He didn't turn on the lamp. He just stood near the foot of the bed, the faint scent of bourbon and Eleanor's expensive floral perfume radiating off him in the dark. I kept my breathing slow, rhythmic. Deep sleep protocol. He unbuckled his belt, the leather making a soft snapping sound, and I heard him let out a long, arrogant exhale. "Everything is fine," he muttered to himself in the pitch black, his voice thick with unearned triumph. "Stupid wife doesn't know a thing." He walked into the master bathroom and closed the door. In the darkness of our bedroom, my eyes snapped open. I stared up at the popcorn ceiling, and slowly, a cold, mechanical smile stretched across my face. He was right. The stupid wife didn't know a thing. But the auditor did. And her investigation had just begun. The sterile, aggressive hum of the clinic's overhead fluorescent lighting had always been a source of low-grade migraines for most of the administrative staff. For me, it was the sound of focus. Wednesday morning arrived with the mundane predictability of a ticking clock. I badged into the building at exactly 7:55 a.m., poured a cup of the break room's notoriously bitter, burnt coffee into my ceramic mug, and settled into the worn fabric of my ergonomic chair. To the casual observer, to my supervisor, to the gossiping receptionists, and certainly to David, I was simply logging in for another day of pushing digital paper. I arranged my highlighters in a perfectly straight line beneath my primary monitor. I took a slow, measured sip of the terrible coffee. Then I went to war. I didn't trust my own anger or the adrenaline that had been quietly buzzing in my veins since the restaurant. Emotion is a volatile, unreliable variable. I prefer objective, data-driven analysis. I approached the destruction of my marriage with the exact same ruthless, algorithmic methodology I applied to a rejected, 6-figure insurance claim. I partitioned my dual monitors. On the left screen, the colorful, chaotic interface of the clinic's patient management software remained open, a perfect camouflage of routine productivity. On the right screen, I opened a secure, encrypted browser session. The flash drive Mrs. Vance had slipped into my hand the night before was safely locked in my desk drawer, Its contents were already securely migrated to a cloud-based sandbox environment I had built over my morning cereal. The first step of any successful audit is establishing a secure line of communication. I generated a highly encrypted, temporary email address and sent a single, subject-less message to the alphanumeric string Mrs. Vance had hidden in the metadata of the flash drive's root folder. The ledger is under review. Commencing reconciliation. Her reply arrived exactly 14 minutes later. It contained no greetings, no pleasantries. It was a dense, meticulously structured spreadsheet detailing every fabricated investment milestone David had presented to Eleanor over the past 4 months. My fingers flew across the keyboard, the rhythmic, percussive clatter blending seamlessly with the office noise around me. I began cross-referencing Vance's corporate timeline with my domestic one. Every time David had claimed he was stuck at a mandatory dealership inventory weekend, a wire transfer from the fraudulent second mortgage had been routed through a shell LLC to pay for Eleanor's luxury weekend getaways. The architecture of his deceit was structurally sound, built on layers of obfuscation, but he had made one critical, arrogant error. He had outsourced the forgery. To secure the second mortgage without my physical presence, he had utilized a rogue notary public, a sleazy associate from his network of auto loan fixers. I didn't need to yell at David to prove it. I simply drafted a legally binding compliance demand, utilizing the clinic's standard template for HIPAA video retention requests, heavily modified to sound like a state-level regulatory inquiry. I faxed it directly to the management office of the strip mall where the notary operated, citing a mandatory audit of timestamped security footage for the exact date and hour the mortgage documents were signed. The trap was being laid, pixel by pixel, document by document. If you are watching this and you've ever had to work twice as hard just to get half the respect, hit that subscribe button. Because this story is about what happens when you stop being polite and start keeping receipts. Stay with me. By the time I pulled into our driveway that evening, the heavy, humid New Jersey air felt suffocating. The house, the physical asset David had secretly leveraged to finance his delusions, stood quiet in the twilight. David was already home, slouched on our expensive microfiber sofa, a glass of bourbon resting on his chest. He didn't even look up from his phone when I walked in. He was radiating a suffocating, smug energy, an arrogance that had metastasized since he believed he had successfully secured his new, wealthy life. Over a dinner of reheated pasta, the microaggressions flowed freely. He complained about the stagnant energy of the suburbs. He casually mentioned how the house felt too small, too dated, hinting heavily that perhaps we should evaluate our long-term equity. He was testing the waters, calculating how easily he could manipulate me into a clean divorce where he walked away with the liquidated assets of the home he had already secretly mortgaged. He looked at my tired eyes, my sensible cardigan, and smiled a slow, predatory smile. He saw a compliant, visionless clerk who would simply fold under pressure. I smiled back, nodding softly, playing the perfectly dull, accommodating wife. I even offered to take his car for an oil change that weekend so he could focus on his big presentation. He had no idea that while he was savoring his bourbon, I had already initiated the final phase of my silent audit. Later that night, while the shower ran and David meticulously styled his hair for another late-night networking event, I sat on the edge of the bed with my laptop. I logged into our primary joint checking account, the account where my steady, dependable payroll deposits served as the only real bedrock. David was scheduled to fly to Hawaii with Eleanor the following week. He had purchased 2 first-class tickets on a premium airline, scheduling the payment to clear on Friday at midnight to avoid my weekly budget review. With 3 silent clicks of my trackpad, I completely froze the joint account, locking it behind a biometric security wall only my thumbprint could bypass. But I didn't stop there. I accessed the bank's automated fraud prevention portal and inputted a highly specific, time-delayed rule. I flagged the airline's merchant ID. At exactly 11:59 p.m. on Friday, the transaction for the first-class tickets would be violently rejected, instantly triggering an automated suspicious activity alert to all associated creditors. It wouldn't just decline his card, It would freeze his entire financial ecosystem right as he was trying to board a plane with his billionaire heiress. I closed the laptop, the screen going black, leaving me in the quiet shadows of the bedroom. The numbers were aligned. The equations were balanced. Now it was time for the execution. The illusion of absolute control is a dangerous narcotic, and by Thursday evening, David was completely intoxicated by it. He walked through the front door just as the sun dipped below the manicured tree-line of our subdivision, carrying a distressed leather portfolio and a palpable aura of smug invincibility. He had spent the entire week meticulously curating his exit strategy, operating under the fatal assumption that I was exactly who he told his friends I was, a docile, spreadsheet-pushing drone with zero peripheral vision. He thought he was playing three-dimensional chess while I was staring blankly at a checkerboard. I was at the kitchen island, wiping down the immaculate granite with a microfiber cloth when he dropped the heavy portfolio onto the counter. The thick leather landed with a muffled, authoritative thud. He loosened his silk tie, exhaling a long, theatrical sigh. "Bureaucracy," he muttered, shaking his head with a practiced, weary smile. "My accountant is auditing the LLC's historical data for the new investor merger, and apparently, our joint filings from 3 years ago got flagged for a clerical error. He needs some routine tax amendments signed, just to clear the escrow liabilities." He unzipped the portfolio and slid a dense stack of legal-sized documents toward me. At the edge of the pages, neat little yellow arrow flags pointed to designated signature lines. I didn't immediately reach for them. I let the silence stretch for just a fraction of a second, watching the micro-expressions on his face. There was a twitch of impatience at the corner of his jaw. He needed this done quickly, without scrutiny. "Taxes?" I said, keeping my voice soft, laced with just enough naive hesitation to feed his ego. "I thought our CPA handled all of the digital filings." "He does, Sarah," David replied, the patronizing tone dripping from every syllable. "But the new firm's underwriters are dinosaurs. They want wet ink on physical paper for the liability waivers. It's a formality. Just sign by the yellow tags so I can overnight this to Manhattan." I finally pulled the stack toward me. The paper was heavy, premium 100-pound bond. My eyes swept over the first page, effortlessly bypassing the bold, distracting header he had likely typed up to look like a standard IRS 1040X cover sheet. Beneath the superficial jargon, the structural DNA of the document was glaringly obvious. These weren't tax amendments. They were quitclaim deeds, intertwined with a labyrinth of spousal indemnification clauses. He was legally restructuring the debt of the forged second mortgage, shifting the entirety of the financial liabilities squarely onto my shoulders while simultaneously erasing my equity in the house. It was, objectively, a brilliant piece of predatory paperwork. But it relied on one fatal flaw: my blind compliance. "Okay," I murmured, offering him a sweet, vacuous smile. "Let me just grab my reading glasses from the study, and I'll get these done." He didn't object. He simply turned his back, opening the liquor cabinet to pour himself a celebratory measure of Macallan. I walked into my home office, pulling the heavy oak door completely shut until the latch clicked. I didn't turn on the overhead light, relying only on the pale glow of my monitor. I set his stack of documents on the desk. From the locked bottom drawer, I retrieved a single, flawlessly printed sheet of matching 100-pound bond paper. It was a document I had drafted 48 hours prior, cross-referencing state financial fraud statutes and utilizing the specific, convoluted vernacular of asset forfeiture. I had formatted it as Addendum C, Secondary Liability Acknowledgement. The margins perfectly matched his stack. However, nested within the dense block text, rendered in an unassuming 8-point Times New Roman font, was an explicit, legally binding confession. It detailed the unauthorized use of my social security number, the falsification of the notary's stamp, and his unilateral responsibility for the entirety of the fraudulent debt. I carefully slipped my addendum between pages 4 and 5 of his stack, affixing one of his own yellow arrow flags directly next to the signature line. When I returned to the kitchen, David was leaning against the counter, swirling the amber liquid in his crystal glass. I placed the stack back on the island, uncapped a blue ballpoint pen, and began signing. I signed exactly where the yellow flags told me to. When I reached page 4, I smoothly flipped it over, exposing Addendum C. Here, I said, sliding the stack back to him. Your turn. The accountant flagged a few spots for the primary earner to initial. David didn't even put his glass down. He pulled a heavy, silver Montblanc pen from his breast pocket. He didn't read the headers. He didn't check the pagination. Blinded by his own arrogance and desperate to finalize the illusion he had built for his billionaire heiress, he simply looked for the yellow tags. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The sound of his fountain pen tearing across the heavy paper was the most beautiful symphony I had ever heard. He was actively signing his own federal indictment, and he did it with a satisfied, condescending smirk on his face. Thanks, babe, he said, carelessly shoving the documents back into his portfolio. I know this stuff goes right over your head, but it's going to pay off. You'll see. I know it will, I replied. Friday morning arrived with a crisp, unforgiving clarity. The dawn light filtered through the blinds, casting long, sharp shadows across the hardwood floor. In the master bathroom, David was armor-plating himself. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit, a crisp white shirt, and a silk tie that cost more than my weekly groceries. He was vibrating with adrenaline, spraying a heavy dose of Tom Ford cologne before grabbing his briefcase. He was heading to Eleanor's corporate plaza to finalize what he believed was a multi-million-dollar investment contract. Don't wait up, he called out from the foyer, the heavy mahogany front door slamming shut behind him. I stood in the silence of the empty house. I didn't reach for my clinic badge. I didn't pack my lunch. Instead, I put on a sharp, structured black blazer and a pair of sensible, quiet heels. I picked up a thick, meticulously organized manila folder containing the original flash drive, the bank logs, and a high-resolution scan of the addendum David had signed the night before. While David steered his least luxury sedan east toward the glittering skyline of Manhattan to claim his fake empire, I backed my sensible sedan out of the driveway and turned west. I wasn't going to the clinic. I was driving straight to the federal courthouse. The air in the closing attorney's office was thick with a scent of aged leather, floor wax, and lemon pledge. It was exactly 4 months and 12 days since I had walked out of Eleanor's boardroom, leaving David to the mercy of federal agents. I sat across from a massive mahogany desk, watching a legitimate, state-certified notary firmly press her brass seal onto the final page of my real estate closing documents. The heavy, metallic thud of the stamp echoing in the quiet room was the most satisfying percussion I had ever heard. Untangling the mess of the forged second mortgage hadn't required tears or dramatic courtroom outbursts. It had required patience, an ironclad legal mandate, and the meticulous unraveling of David's fraudulent financial architecture. Because I had handed the federal prosecutor a fully confessed, flawlessly documented white-collar case, the fraudulent liens against my property were voided by judicial decree. I petitioned for, and was granted, sole, unencumbered title to the property. I didn't keep the house. The structure itself held no sentimental value to me anymore. It was merely an asset that needed to be liquidated and reallocated. I staged it, listed it during a seller's market peak, and closed the sale for exactly double its original equity. When the closing attorney slid the final settlement statement across the desk, I didn't smile. I simply verified the routing numbers, signed my name with a heavy, black fountain pen, and watched a 6-figure wire transfer hit my secure, individually managed banking portfolio. The suburban house in New Jersey, the microfiber sofa, the echoing silence of the garage waiting for a luxury sedan that would never return, it was all officially erased from my ledger. David's ledger, conversely, was permanently stained. He was currently residing at a federal correctional institution, serving a mandatory, non-parole sentence for multi-count interstate bank fraud, wire fraud, and aggravated identity theft. I never visited him. I never answered the desperate, heavily monitored phone calls he attempted to make from the facility during the first few weeks. I didn't need to see him in standard-issue khaki to understand the absolute devastation of his reality. A man who measured his entire self-worth by the cut of his bespoke suits, the exclusivity of his restaurant reservations, and the manufactured admiration of the women he deceived was now reduced to an inmate number. His days were heavily scheduled, stripped of all autonomy, dictated by the harsh fluorescent lights of a government facility. His luxury cars had been repossessed. His bank accounts had been seized and liquidated by the state to pay mandatory restitution. He was bankrupt, both financially and fundamentally. He had tried to play a high-stakes game of Monopoly using counterfeit money, and the bank had finally foreclosed on his life. The transition to my new normal was utterly devoid of the chaotic, emotional fallout that usually accompanies the implosion of a decade-long marriage. There was no finding myself retreat. There was only elevation. My tenure as a mid-level billing coordinator had concluded. The flawless, algorithmic precision with which I had audited and dismantled David's complex financial web had not gone unnoticed by the right people. Today, the light filtering into my workspace does not come from a flickering overhead fluorescent bulb. It pours in through the expansive, floor-to-ceiling glass windows of a corner office overlooking the sprawling, 80-acre campus of the state's largest private hospital network. The heavy, frosted glass door bears a brushed steel plaque that reads, Sarah Hayes, Regional Director of Financial Operations. I sit in a high-backed, ergonomically perfect leather chair, operating a 4-monitor terminal. I no longer fight with insurance adjusters over $50 copays. I dictate the financial compliance protocols for a network generating hundreds of millions of dollars in annual revenue. I command a department of 60 analysts and auditors. When I walk into a boardroom, the low hum of conversation ceases immediately. There is no condescension. There are no patronizing smiles. There is only the absolute, undeniable respect that comes from knowing I possess the intellect to dismantle an entire corporate infrastructure if I find a single, misplaced decimal point. The system works, provided you know exactly how to write the code. Looking out over the manicured courtyards of the hospital campus, holding a cup of premium black coffee that tastes nothing like the burnt sludge from my old break room, I feel a profound, quiet equilibrium. The equation is perfectly balanced. Betrayal is not a tragedy to be wept over. It is not solved by screaming, throwing plates against a wall, or demanding apologies from a narcissist incapable of genuine remorse. Betrayal is, at its core, a structural anomaly. It is a corrupted file in the system. A simple clerical error that threatens the integrity of your entire database. And as my life has proven, I am exceptionally good at deleting faulty records. If this reminded you of a battle you had to win in silence, share this video, subscribe, and drop a comment below. I'll see you in the next story.